Welcome back, family, to Black House Lives book lecture series, where we are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's blueprint for Black Power. Our last lecture was on chapter 22, Demographic Foundations of an African Nation Within a Nation. And in that chapter, Wilson argued that the hypersegregation of Africans in America could serve as a strategic economic advantage if Africans were to organize themselves as a nation. And taking Du Bois's economic proposal to its fullest extent, Wilson also argued that the Black consumer could not only control the business and economic market in his own community, but if organized effectively, the African nation could penetrate and eventually dominate the white economic market as well. In this lecture, Chapter 24, The Black Consumer and the Economics of Afrocentrism, Wilson will show us how not only Black business producers and consumers understand the values of the red, black, and green, but so does white business producers and consumers, right? And Wilson argues that if this is not properly controlled and regulated, that whites will continue to dominate the Black market and control the major share of the Black dollar. So Wilson provides us some solutions to fighting against this, and I'm excited to jump right into it. So let's go. Black consumer power. According to Wilson, uh, we are a consumer society, right? And what he means by that, he says that the tastes, the preferences, essentially the consumer profile, right, are what influences the economic expansion or economic decline of a nation. Right. He also argues that this economic expansion or economic decline, it influences the increase or decrease of job opportunities, right? Which will then influence the quality of life that people have. So right out of the gate, Wilson wants us to understand the important role of the Black consumer. Citing Du Bois, Wilson argues that the most hopeful solution is a racial attempt to use the power of the Negro as a consumer, not only for his economic uplift, but in addition to that, for his economic education. So what is Du Bois saying here? Du Bois is saying that the time of Black folks just being aimless spenders eventually has to come to an end, right? I can think of, examples around this time, around the holiday season, where Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam has been integral in injecting right into the Black consciousness, the suggestion that we be judicious with our dollars, right, and not just feed this Western economic machine in the name of giving gifts, right? And so, really thinking about how we as consumers can really impact our economic reality, right, while simultaneously impacting others' economic realities as well. Du Bois argues that as a consumer, the Negro approaches economic equality much more nearly than he ever has as a producer, right? Du Bois is saying that organizing then and conserving and using intelligently the power which 12 million people, which was the size of the Black population in 1930, have through what they buy, it is possible for the American Negro to help in rebuilding of the economic state. Du Bois is saying that it is going to be the Black consumer that helps to rebuild, right, the African economic state, right? It is going to be the Black consumer who changes the economic reality of Africans in America and throughout the diaspora, right? Citing Du Bois, Wilson argues that the Black consumer will achieve economic parity much quicker as a consumer than as producer, right? Time is not on our side, and thus, if we organize effectively, use our spending power to our advantage, Wilson argues that we can turn the economic clock on its head and as a result, rebuild the economic state for Africans. Let's keep going. Black consumer power. Furthermore, Du Bois contended that the Black consumer, his social institutions are almost entirely the institutions of consumers. And it is precisely along the development of these institutions that he can move in general accordance with the economic development of his time and of the large white group, and also in this way evolve unified organization for his own economic salvation. For the Black consumer, it is going to be in the Black consumer continuing to build these types of institutions, right? These types of businesses that are going to allow us to make the type of economic progress, the economic gains that we need to make. All right, and Wilson will continue to unpack this as the chapter goes on. Alien merchants and Black consumers. According to Wilson and Du Bois, the value of the Black consumer cannot be overstated. Wilson says, just look at all of the money that non-Blacks pour into marketing and other avenues to attract the Black consumer. I strongly recommend the reading of Tom Burrell's Brainwashed. Tom Burrell, an African-American marketer, advertiser. He's made millions and millions of dollars, right, off of his strategic marketing, right, to African-American people, of African-American people. And his book talks about the ways in which millions and billions of dollars are used to attract the Black consumer. And so I would highly, highly recommend this. Wilson is trying to get us to understand in this particular section, most specifically, is a lot of non-Black folks recognize how wealthy the Black community is. They also analyze and study the amount of wealth that the Black community has, right? And a part of their business models is learning how to extract that money from the Black community, right? If you're not putting those Black dollars in Black banks, right, and Black financial institutions, then wherever you're putting them, right, these non-Black financial institutions want your money with them, okay? And Tom Burrell lists a number of those strategies and the ways in which they do that. So I strongly recommend that book, but let's jump back into it. Wilson argues that the Black entrepreneur has been practically excluded from both Black and non-Black marketplaces. This starvation of Black businesses has permitted other ethnic groups to economically thrive, or at least to survive in the Black consumer market, right? It has allowed them to monopolize and use it to exploit the Black community as a whole, while at the same time disrespecting it and demonstrating racial hatred toward it, and not supporting it politically, socially, institutionally, or in any other socially positive manner. What is Wilson saying here? Everyone else has been able to eat off the Black dollar except Black folks, right? Um, Small Black business owners lose out on the Black dollar because they are unable to provide the same type of sales as the larger mainstream companies and businesses, right? They have to tax. They try to be able to compete, right, with those mainstream organizations and things of that nature. They may not have the variety of goods, right, and services that the mainstream companies and businesses have, right? And so because of all of those types of things, the starvation of Black businesses has permitted other ethnic groups to economically thrive, right, off of the Black dollar. Wilson reminds us that when these non-Black businesses are established in our communities, they do not employ Black folks from the community. Wilson argues that the few that are employed are never employed with the intent of partnering with those community members, but it's only to maintain them at some entry-level position. The business relationship is never mutually beneficial for the Black community and the non-Black business owner, right? And so, again, throughout this book, Wilson has been discussing the non-Black business owners in our communities. And here Wilson is making the argument that not only are these businesses established in our community, right, but they do not hire the folks in the community, right? And when they do, they are hired in these entry-level positions. They're never brought in to be partners or brought in to be, CEOs or anything like that. What does the Black consumer, i.e., the Black community, get in return for supporting these non-Black businesses in their communities? According to Wilson, these and many other forms of economic racism not only mean the chronic insulting and underserving of the Black consumer, but more importantly, means that the Black consumer pays more and gets less than any other consumer group. Wilson asks a question: what do Black folks get for their loyalty? Right, their blind loyalty to shopping at these businesses, supporting these businesses. Right, what do we get in return for them? And Wilson says simply a bunch of economic racism, right? the chronic insulting and underserving of the Black consumer, right? We pay more, we get less. According to Wilson, we as a community, Black folks, have overspent or over deposited our incomes, investing indirectly in white corporations and financial establishments, i.e., banks, corporations, and foundations, right? We have invested with non-Black merchants, businesses, and financial institutions of all types. And as a result, the Black community has been repaid little to nothing. The money that we are earning, right, every week, every 2 weeks, we are depositing into non-Black banks. We are investing, right, in non-Black financial institutions. And if we don't understand that that's having a long-term uh, effect and impact on African American people being able to actualize their economic dreams, if Africans throughout the world, throughout the diaspora, being able to actualize their own dreams, if we don't understand that by us investing our money in other people's institutions, it's going to have some type of effect on us, then we are hustling backwards. Wilson argues that this exploitation by white American and immigrant merchant communities is but one of the causes responsible for our current economic situation, right? So the economic racism for Wilson is but one of the causes responsible for our current economic reality. Wilson does an excellent job in this book and throughout this book at getting the African community, the African American community, to look ourselves in the mirror and understand the ways in which we perpetuate, right, some of these same behaviors. And yet, Wilson argues many Black leaders today continue to harp on the economic racist aspect of the economic problem, but none of the other problems. Alien merchants and Black consumers. The Black consumer, according to Wilson, is largely to blame for the tossing to the winds of our economic power and placing our wealth in outside institutions unconsciously. And at this point, I would argue it's pretty conscious. So while economic racism plays one part of it, right, and is a major facet of the economic reality of African people today, um, what we cannot do is blame white folks for the fact that we as African people continue to deposit, right, our money into non-Black financial institutions, right? That's our fault, right? We can't blame anybody else other than the fact that we continue to shop with non-Black business owners and buying manufacturing products that were not developed, right, by Black folks. And so we're tossing to the winds our own wealth, right, and circumventing the health and wealth of our community by not supporting the mind. The civil rights movement, a consumer movement. Wilson has been hinting at for the last 23 chapters that all is not lost. The African American economic dominance that we've known and read and studied about, right? Wilson argues can be reimagined and can be reinstituted. And so Wilson reminds us that we've done this all before. And in other movements, specifically the civil rights movement being one of the last major demonstrations of Black consumer power during the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s, meaning that if we've done it before, we can do it again, right? And Wilson, for the next few pages, uses the civil rights movement as an example, right, of a consumer movement. Let's jump into it. So Wilson argued that the civil rights movement was just as much about the Black consumer's right to consumption privileges as non-Black consumers. Wilson argues that consumption privileges on the part of Black consumers consisted of the right and privilege of Black consumers to spend their earnings in the same ways and places as whites. That the landmark Montgomery bus boycott, essentially a Black consumer movement, and sit-ins at lunch counters and other white-owned businesses and institutions were also Black consumer demonstrations. What Wilson is explaining here, right, that the civil rights movement, right, and many of the demonstrations that were offshoots of the civil rights movement, these were fights for consumption privileges. And Wilson defines consumption privileges, right, as Black consumers having the right and the privilege, right, to spend their earnings in the same ways and places as whites. So Wilson is arguing that the civil rights movement was nothing more than Black folks fighting for the right to be able to spend their money like white people. Let's continue to unpack this. Wilson argues that Black consumers withdrew their economic support from offending white institutions, and through sit-ins, marches, demonstrations, and other tactics, blockaded consumers of other ethnic groups from supporting these entities as well, right? So you organizing ourselves in a particular type of way allowed us to be able to apply pressure, right? To leverage our spending power that we have by applying pressure, right? And withdrawing our economic support from those white institutions that continue to display economic racism towards individual Black people and toward the Black community overall, right? And we were also able to organize ourselves in a way where we're able to apply pressure on other ethnic groups as well, right? To get them to stop supporting those racist entities as well. Wilson argues that Black consumer power, represented by local organizations such as Operation Breadbasket and Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity, they organized a consumer strategy that involved boycotting businesses that did not employ African Americans. Wilson argues that the consumer movement led to the hiring of thousands of African American workers, the stocking of stores with products manufactured by African Americans, and the hiring of African American contractors, and more money is deposited into Black banks. So Wilson is acknowledging the work of civil rights leaders, right, during the civil rights movement, right, and some of the gains that they were able to win as a result of their organizing. And so folks like, Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity, and Operation Breadbasket, they organized Black consumers in a way where we were able to apply pressure, right, on the mainstream. And we won the hiring of thousands of African American workers, the stocking of stores with African American manufactured products, right? And more money is being deposited into African American banks. Those were wins on the side of Operation Breadbasket and Operation Push. According to Wilson, Operation Push was organized to press for Black business development, right? And Push's efforts also led to increased economic opportunity for the Black community in terms of very significant increases in the quantity and quality of jobs held by Blacks and the number of Blacks who came to own business franchises. In addition to, it increased the use of services offered by Black-owned firms by white-owned corporations. So according to Wilson, right, Operation Push organized the community for Black business development. Right, we started to see more economic opportunities for the Black community. We started to see more, not just the increase of jobs, but quality jobs, right, for Black folks. All right. We saw an increase in the services that Black-owned firms were able to provide, right, for the community. All right. Again, these are the wins of Operation Breadbasket and Operation Push. The consumer movement, victorious defeat. All right. In this section, Wilson is going to pivot, right? Well, he gets us to critically analyze, right, the work of those previous civil rights leaders, right, and the way in which they approached the consumer movement, right? So, according to Wilson, while the expansion in economic and employment opportunities were commendable, and legal and social removal of legal and social restrictions on the freedoms of Blacks are to be applauded, the interests of overall Black business and economic development were not well served. What is Wilson saying here? Wilson is saying that on the one end, Operation Push, Operation Breadbasket deserve to be commended, right, for the economic and employment opportunities that they provided our community, right, for getting legal and social restrictions removed, right? But Wilson contends that the overall interest, the overall business, the overall economic interest for Black folks was not well served. And according to Wilson, not only were the interests of overall Black businesses and economic development not well served, Wilson argues that they may actually have been harmed. Wilson argues that a case can be made that the economic emphasis of the civil rights movement was on jobs. as applied by white businesses instead of on community-based economic expansion, right? Or on income rather than wealth, or on spending rather than saving. The freedom to spend money with white businesses and establishments became almost synonymous with political freedom or first class citizenship in the minds of many African Americans. Wilson argues that this led to the redistribution of Black consumer spending away from Black businesses and toward white business establishments, with the result that many Black businesses lost a large portion, if not their complete, Black clientele. Y'all, this is a major bar that we don't talk enough about in our barbershops, in our beauty salons, in college classrooms, and conferences across the nation. We help to turn our communities economically outward as opposed to organizing ourselves for economic liberation and self-sufficiency. The civil rights movement helped to redistribute Black wealth, right, toward white businesses, right, white institutions, white financial institutions, right, and not inward to support our own. And we are still suffering the consequences, right, of those civil rights leaders. Let's keep going. According to Dr. Wilson, the civil rights movement proved to be a boon to white-owned businesses by providing them with a large new clientele, a new market, and a very sizable pool of money unavailable to them before. Wilson argues that the increased spending of Black consumers with white-owned businesses, as well as businesses owned by other ethnic groups, the broadly expanded opportunities for Black consumers to enter into markets previously closed to them, the opportunities for non-Black owned business establishments to penetrate previously restricted consumer markets in the Black community helps to increase the customer/client bases in their gross and net incomes. But this was not paralleled by white and other ethnic group consumer spending in the opposite direction, i.e. spending with the Black community. What we saw with the civil rights movement was money flowing in one direction. The civil rights movement didn't lead to white folks coming into Black neighborhoods and spending money in Black neighborhoods, shopping in Black neighborhoods, right, investing in Black neighborhoods. But with middle-class Black folks who were seeking the consumption privileges to spend their money not only like in the ways in which white folks spend their money, right, but spend it with them, like them, at the expense of the African community. Wilson will continue to unpack this. According to Dr. Wilson, the non-Black consumer has never demonstrated much of an inclination to spend with Black businesses. White philanthropy, right, white business owners, right, have never shown a need or a desire, right, to want to invest in Black businesses, not a significant investment. White consumers distance themselves from the possibility of spending with Black firms to any real significant extent by literally leaving the central cities. Wilson explained in previous chapters how in the midst of America's decline, right, that America economically is not the same powerhouse that it once was, right? And as a result of this, it sheltered many of the inner city retail stores that they had and moved them out to the suburbs. And as a result, right, many of the white folks who lived in inner cities, right, or around the inner cities, they relocated to the suburbs as well, right, with those retail stores. Wilson argues that white-owned business establishments oblige white customers by the construction of suburban and rural shopping malls and the wholesale movement of businesses and productions of facilities out of the inner cities into the suburban and rural areas as well, resulting in both actual and potential Black business establishments and Black workers abandoned by both white business establishments and white customers. So the Black businesses that are left in the community, the local businesses that are left in the community, right, can only be supported by that Black working class, right? Because all of the other classes and races of people have left the inner cities and have relocated, right, with those retail stores. And Wilson argues that this resulted in both actual and potential Black business establishments and Black workers being abandoned. A lot of Black folks lost their jobs. They worked in those retail stores. And when those retail stores relocated, those Black folks were not reassigned. They just lost out. Wilson argues that this situation has not been systematically addressed by a Black leadership establishment. Right, the fact that the civil rights movement got us to invest our money, right, and spend our money with white folks and not support Black businesses, right? Wilson argues that this has not been systematically addressed by a Black leadership establishment and appears to be still futilely pursuing obsolete civil rights goals while using equally obsolete and counterproductive civil rights strategies. Wilson is saying that we are still too much focused on civil rights strategies, many of which have already proved to be irrelevant and do not work. And so, if our ancestors in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s were imprisoned or killed using particular strategies, it would be foolish for us in 2022, right, to pick up those same strategies and try to use them. Or even if they were successful in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, it is not to say that those same strategies would be useful today in 2022. Wilson argued that an organized Black consumers movement is still central to any new initiative by the African American community, and Black consumer-based strategies must be utilized in their achievement. So Wilson is saying that whatever the liberation strategy is for Black folks, a Black consumer movement should be at the heart of that, right? Should be somewhere involved in that process, right? And that the African American community and Black consumer based strategies must be utilized in their achievement. We are going to be the ones to save each other, not anybody else, right? It's going to be the strategies that we devise, right, and not somebody else's. But Wilson says, however, according for this to happen, the community must be radically different from the goals sought by leaders of the civil rights movement. Today's goals have to look drastically different from the goals that were set out and established by the civil rights leaders of old. Wilson will answer the question, why? According to Wilson, a point of departure from the civil rights leaders of yesterday is necessary because the main focus of those leaders that utilized organized Black consumer movements was to achieve assimilationist goals, to acquire a few franchises and distributorships, right, to be distributed among a few already well-heeled Blacks, right? This is what has essentially left the Black community abandoned of a self-sufficient, self-perpetuating economic system. Because we have been left with these leaders who are all too willing to settle for assimilationist goals, to acquire a few trinkets, i.e. franchises and distributorships. Nothing more, nothing less. According to Dr. Wilson, the Black community's rejecting of Black nationalist sentiment. Black nationalist leaders like Garvey and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad missed an opportunity to learn of and utilize a Black consumer movement whose goals were much more practically relevant, politically and socio-psychologically beneficial to the community, and much more national and international in scope than the goals pursued previously by civil rights leaders. We were too afraid of the radical messaging of Marcus Garvey. We were too afraid of the radical messagings of Elijah Muhammad, and so we dismissed those messages. And Wilson is arguing that by us dismissing the message of the Black nationalists, right, we adopted assimilationist type ideologies and perspectives. We lost the mindsets around doing for self, right, and being coochie chocolatean and self-determined in that way, to being reliant on someone else doing things for us. According to Wilson, these movements sought to organize and direct Black consumer spending in such ways as to increase and enlarge Black business ownership, to enlarge Black economic and job opportunities, to enhance Black economic, social, and political self-sufficiency and power, to establish a free and independent Pan-African political and economic system, and by these means, to liberate African peoples from white domination. That's the goal. Is liberation from the liberation of African peoples from white domination. We're not trying to make a bunch of rich Negroes. We're not trying to make a bunch of rich Africans, right? We are trying to devise the pathway to African liberation and the end of white domination over African people wherever they are found in the world. Solutions. Wilson provides several solutions in this chapter. According to Wilson, these goals are still valid today, right? The consumer movement goals. He argues that one of the means by which we are to achieve these goals must include the organization and the redirection of African American and Pan African modes of consumption, right? We have to tap into our Afrocentric modes of entrepreneurialism, our Afrocentric modes of business acumen, because there are other communities who have realized, have learned, and studied the ways in which they can use Pan African and African modes of consumption against us to steal Black dollars from the community, to acquire loyal Black spenders by utilizing Pan African modes of consumption to their benefit. Spending habits of the Black consumer. Citing data from the American Demographic 1993, Wilson argues that this data provided an interesting look at the spending habits of the average Black household. According to Wilson, it provides insight into the taste and preferences of Blacks in comparison with those of whites, demonstrating significant differences in many areas, but also quantifying in dollars how much Blacks spend with mostly white-owned and non-Black owned businesses. Right? So Wilson uses the data to back up this argument, right, that Black folks' spending habits and what we spend our money on are not the same things that white folks are spending their money on, right? And Black spending habits and white spending habits are not the same. And what does that mean? Why is this information useful? Wilson's research then shows some buying trends of African American consumers, right? In these particular areas, African American people disproportionately spent their money, right? Again, in these areas as opposed to other groups. So, food, alcoholic beverages, housing, apparel and services, transportation, entertainment, personal care products. African Americans disproportionately spend more of their money in these areas, right, than other groups of people. Why is this important? Citing data from Target Market News 1993, gathered from in-person interviews and diaries from more than 2,800 African American households, the findings were similar to the American demographic information just cited. Target News found that Black households spend 3 times more than non-Black households on small appliances, twice as much on laundry, dry cleaning, and perishable foods. We spend 50% more on footwear. Wilson argues that the data reveals that in almost no category do Black-owned business capture a significant percentage of the Black consumer dollar. If Black folks disproportionately spend their money in those other areas than all other races of people, then it would make sense for Black folks to control those markets, or for Black business owners to have a dominant presence, right, in those markets. However, we don't. Wilson argues that the data reveals that in almost no category do Black-owned businesses capture a significant percentage of the Black consumer dollar. Wilson argues that the capture of Black-owned businesses of even 3 or 4 of the products and service categories listed there, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, smoking supplies, television, radios, sound equipment, household furniture, etc., would add $12 billion or more to the total receipts of Black-owned businesses. We could significantly increase or change the reality of some Black entrepreneurs just by Black folks supporting other Black entrepreneurs. Just from Black consumers supporting Black manufactured products. And as of the 90s, when this book was written, right, if we were able to add 12 billion, right, to the total receipts of the Black-owned businesses, right, just imagine, right, today we'd be somewhere in the trillions. Let's keep going. Wilson argues that the Black consumer spends enormous sums of money with non-Black establishments, which, if consciously spent with the same or similar Black-owned establishments, would revolutionize not only the Black business community, but the entire Black community. By keeping our money in our communities, or by shopping with and spending our money with folks who live in our communities, right? We are investing and reinvesting into our communities with the opportunity, right, of making them safer and better long-term places for our offspring. There'd be no reason for us to get these really, really good paying jobs and make all of this money, right? And then move our children out of our neighborhoods and communities, right? We'd simply be handing the community down, right, to our children and to our grandchildren. We would be empowering them to step up and to lead the community right into the next generation. There will be no need for them to seek alternative places to live, alternative communities to be a part of. Wilson asks, in light of the huge sums of money the Black consumer spends with white-owned and other non-Black-owned business establishments, what does it receive for such establishment? What do Black folks get in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of trade, in terms of philanthropic return? What does the Black community get? Wilson asks, what do Black consumers get in return for their exceedingly generous, consistently loyal support of white and other non-Black owned businesses? What do we get for our, right? You know how these credit card companies and stuff like that do loyalty points, right? So for shopping and consistently sliding that card, they give you these cash back points, right? Wilson is asking, what do Black consumers get for their loyalty? Spending habits of the Black consumer. Wilson argues that the returns Black consumers get for supporting non-Black businesses and communities, for enriching them while impoverishing their own, is arithmetically insignificant. Right? Wilson is saying when measured, when we step back and we really look at right what philanthropic organizations give back to Black and brown companies, it is criminal. It's absolutely criminal. According to Wilson, a review of the contributions the Fortune 500 corporations make to Black nonprofit organizations and institutions, community economic and social development programs, it provides a sobering set of evidence, right? That says there's a lack of reciprocity in regards to their Black consumers who contribute mightily to their bottom lines. Wilson argues that the lack of reciprocity with regards to their Black consumers who contribute mightily to their bottom lines should serve as evidence to Black business folks, to Black consumers, that the elite has never had any significant plans on investing in Black businesses and Black people. This country has never had a genuine commitment to investing in Black people. According to Wilson, the combined annual philanthropic contributions to Black nonprofit organizations by any of the Fortune 500 companies which do business in these and other industries rarely exceed $500,000. And more typically, they remain in the area between $100,000 to $200,000. Wilson is making the argument that there are very few white institutions who are making $500,000, $750,000, $1 million donations and investments into Black small businesses. And the investments that they do make tend to only be on the side of 100,000 here, 200,000 there, or less. Wilson argues that the real problem here is not the presence of the lack of generosity of white-owned corporations, right? Wilson isn't arguing that there's a lack of white philanthropy, right, on the behalf of white folks. But what he is saying is that the black consumer community asks very little or nothing for the money it spends with these establishments. For the 20, 30, 40, 50 years that our parents and grandparents have shopped and spent money, right, with these non-black organizations. And then we then come behind them, right, and we spend all of our money with the same businesses and the same organizations, and we ask or demand nothing from these people. Wilson says that we get what we demand. And if we've made no demands on them, that's the reason why we have gotten very little, if anything, from them. Wilson asks, what could the black consumer demand from corporations with which they spend billions of dollars? Right? Which is a legitimate question. Some black folks don't even know that there are demands that they could be making of the corporation. Or you have that demographic of black folks who are talking about, oh, hey, what white folks ain't never gonna let us do, right? Or what they could care less about us doing. So what could the black consumer demand from corporations? Wilson argues that the black consumer could and should demand increases in black employment on all levels, in the numbers of black distributorships, wholesale, retail, and manufacturing outlets. Increased black ownership of corporate shares, increased grants to black institutions, increased support given to the economic development of the black American community. This is what a real investment looks like. Putting your money where your mouth is. Increasing black employment on all levels. Again, not just in the entry level position, right? The middle manager positions, as well as those out in front director, you know what I'm saying, assistant director positions as well. Wilson argues that this requires that the black consumer be fully informed about the return they are or not receiving. Right, so black folks have to constantly be researching, right, and asking the questions around mainstream businesses and their support. Additionally, this requires that black consumers have and be motivated and organized to judiciously spend or not spend their monies in such ways as to apply the needed pressure in the marketplace to achieve their goals. If we are going to not spend our money at Christmas, right, and feed this Western economic machine, then we're going to have to be organized in a particular type of way to ensure that black folks are still getting the things that they need. If there are businesses and companies that are displaying their economic racism, right, that we have the means to judiciously organize ourselves, right, and stop putting money and stop funding organizations and institutions that do not love us. Solutions. Wilson argues that the application of such pressure must be exerted under an effective leadership establishment. Wilson argues that one major function of all black-owned or black-oriented media should be repeatedly and as effectively as possible provide the African American community and consumer with vital information about statistics regarding how the corporations and industries they support with their consumer dollars are aiding and abetting or are impairing their general well-being. Right? We need a mouthpiece, a black media mouthpiece. We need someone in black media who is constantly and consistently making black folks aware of, right, the folks who are invested in our community, the folks who are making significant investment in our communities. A, so we can use them as exemplars. B, so that we can hold them up, thank them for the support that they're providing. Solutions. According to Wilson, another demand that can and should be made by the black consumer community is that corporations increase their training of black employees at all occupational levels. The African American community, black consumers, must encourage the corporations to enter an increased number of joint partnerships, joint ventures with individual corporate and organizational members of the community. It is incumbent upon the African community to achieve the knowledge that we need in order to sustain ourselves by any means necessary. So that's going to mean some of us going back to school. This means some of us doing the non-traditional courses. So we're doing night school, homeschool. Brothers and sisters are online, right? Taking online courses to compensate wherever the gaps are. But this has to be part of the demands that African American folks are making, is that we know that there is an information gap. We know that there's going to be a learning curve, and so we demand the training wherever we can get the trainings so that we can plug these holes immediately. Black tourism. Wilson argues that Black-owned or controlled corporate groups, Black church organizations, and Black Commonwealth corporations, i.e. community-owned corporate bodies, with the support of organized Black consumers, together can economically empower the whole of the African American community. Once organized effectively, these Black-owned organizations and corporations can exert economic and political pressure on dominant white America, begin to work for the interests of African people. And according to Wilson, Black tourism is one of those industries that needs such organizing. Black tourism as industry. Wilson argues that the Black American community has a very long history of conventioneering. And so from the convention movement beginning prior to the Civil War to the present, Black organizations in rapidly increasing numbers are in meeting hotels and convention halls across the country, right? Today, the Black tourism, travel, and convention business, according to Wilson, was worth between $2 to $3 billion yearly. And that was as of the printing of this book, right? But as of 2018, that number has increased from 2 to 3 billion. They're anywhere between 63 billion and 109 trillion dollars, right? So it's safe to say that African people are leaving a lot of money on the table, right? We're not taking advantage of the tourism industry in the ways in which we need to. I was listening to a lecture most recently where there were conversations discussing, right, the mishaps of our ancestors back in the day. So in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, we had a significant amount of Black folks, right, who thought coming to Africa, they were going to save our brothers and sisters in Africa. That tourism, right, was one of the main ways that we were going to be able to improve the economic reality, right, of Black folks, and it was through tourism alone. And I was listening to this lecture most recently that talked about, like, if tourism is the only plan that African people and that's both continentally and throughout the diaspora, if tourism is the only plan that African people have for themselves, right, to economically enrich themselves, to defeat white domination, then we again are hustling backwards. The tourism is not going to be the silver bullet. It is not going to be the magical solution, right, to all of our economic woes. However, what Wilson does point out here is economically we are missing some very vital opportunities, right, that could change the economic reality, not just for Africans on the continent, but for Africans throughout the diaspora, right? So let's jump into it. And Wilson argues that even with, all of these Black meetings and Black conferences that are happening in this country and around the world, yet Black businesses and Black organizations spend well over $1 billion with white-owned hotels, with white-owned convention halls and caterers, right? Meanwhile, in those conferences and in those meetings, Wilson says, while we're discussing the poverty and degradation of the Black American community, we're enriching these non-Black businesses, right? And yet these organizations have not invested in, right? These white organizations have not invested in, entered into partnership with established hotel chains owned by Black businesses and men and women. In the very towns, in the very states that we're having these conferences, in the very countries that we're having these conferences and having these conversations, there are Black businesses, there are Black owned hotels in those very towns, right? We're just not being creative enough. We're not doing the leg work. We're not spending enough energy to make these connections when we're doing this particular type of work. Wilson argues that if convention centers were built in these majority Black populated cities, they would not only provide facilities for national convocations, but for local and regional ones as well. Wilson argues that these facilities could also function as community centers, recreational, cultural, and entertainment centers for their local communities. Right? I would add not just being built in these major cities, but they have to be frequented by, they have to be patronized by Black folks, right? In order for them to become useful organizations and useful institutions. The power of refusal. According to Wilson, an economic boycott organized by the subordinate, right, where members of the subordinate participate in refusing to have certain commercial dealings with the powerful, substantially demonstrates how the subordinate may empower themselves and simultaneously disempower the powerful and change the relations and structures of social power. Wilson is trying to get us to understand the power that we have, right, in saying no. The power of us refusing to continue to do business with folks who are economically racist or economically chauvinistic, right? With companies and organizations who have no regard for the liability in the future, right, of the Black community or the African community. We have to understand the power of refusal. Economic democracy. According to Dr. Wilson, true economic development and empowerment of the African American community does not begin with the mere employment of its constituents by other ethnic communities, which own and monopolize all the vital and important means of production and wealth. Wilson reminded us, right, that one of the weaknesses of the civil rights movement, right, was its assimilationist goals. And one of those assimilationist goals were simply Black folks being employed. We didn't care who gave us the job. We just wanted the jobs. Wilson says true economic development is not Black folks being employed by non-Black people or other ethnic communities, which own and monopolize all the vital and important means of production. True economic development would be, right, a group or a people being able to hire their own, being in positions, right, to elevate your own. Meanwhile, and simultaneously, being able to control the means of production, right, in your communities and in your areas. Economic development begin and end with economic organizations of the whole, the African American community, under its own direction of financial control. Right? What we just got done discussing. Economic development, true economic development in the African community would be the African American community under its own direction of financial control, are able to create opportunities for its own community members through our own self-determined commercial and trade organizations and activities. True economic development is not us asking somebody else to do for us. It is African people being able to do for self. Economic democracy. What then is genuine economic democracy? Well, according to Wilson, economic democracy refers to the pluralistic ownership of the economy, its productive resources and facilities, as well as its wealth. By pluralistic, we mean where ethnic groups own meaningful properties in the economy, or where the economy is perceived and utilized as a public trust for the benefit of all of the people instead of as the property of a particular race, right? So currently, a pluralistic ownership is not something that currently exists in the United States. It's not something that currently exists in the current economic market, right? Because only one group of people get to dominate and control the economic market. Only one group of people get to control, right, the vital means of production. And Wilson says that pluralistic means that there is meaningful ownership. The things that people own, right, are successful, are productive, right, or whether the economy is perceived, right, as a public trust for the benefit of all of the people. If all the people do not feel like they can participate in that economic market, then can we really call that economic market pluralistic? And Wilson says no. Economic democracy, according to Wilson, economic democracy is facilitated by the national African American community's development of the leverage and ability to form partnerships to buy substantial equities in ongoing mainstream business concerns, right? So Wilson says true economic development is where a group of people are able to employ their own people, put their own people in positions of power, right? Wilson says that pluralistic ownership is where multiple people, the community perceives as the economic market is one where everybody can benefit. And then Wilson says that economic democracy, right, is facilitated through the community's development of the leverage and ability to form partnerships, to buy in substantial equities in ongoing mainstream business concerns, to purchase such businesses outright, and to invest in worldwide mining, manufacturing, and financial ventures. That's economic democracy. And at current, the African nation, right, the African American community does not possess the ability, right, to form partnerships, to buy substantial equities in mainstream businesses, right, to purchase businesses outright and invest in worldwide mining, manufacturing, and finance. We don't possess that ability quite yet because we're not as organized as we need to be. Wilson argues that economic democracy involves the coming together of community institutions, of community organizations, of individuals and investment groups to form large mutual fund establishments. All right. We talked about just throwing our money to the wind, just tossing our money to the wind. Economic democracy means organizing that wealth and forming large mutual fund establishments, right? So that we have a financial institution to do something with that wealth. And remember, Wilson told us that this goal of ending white domination is not just about controlling the businesses and the market in the African American community or in the African community, right? But we want to control major stake even in the mainstream economies. Because by having some type of control and stake, right, in the mainstream society, we are able to, right, apply pressure, apply leverage, right, in that system as well, so that we do not become impacted in the in the larger game that's being played. Because see, if all we're focusing on is the African American market and the African American economy, then we are at the behest of whichever side the pendulum is swinging, right, in the economic market. But if we have major stake in the mainstream game, we're able to influence it. We're able to make demands on it. Let's keep going. Economic pluralism. So we keep using the word, Wilson kept using the word, right, true economic development, economic pluralism, and economic democracy. And so I thought it was really important to really unpack what he means by these terms. And so, according to Wilson, economic pluralism involves the ideology that Black consumers will not continue to support industries and producers where Blacks are not substantially represented as investors and owners of equity. Right? Remember, we said the time for Black folks just being aimless spenders have to go bye bye. Economic pluralism is the mature African saying that we are not going to continue to support industries and producers where blacks are not substantially represented. If your company or your organization does not have faces like mine, right, being led and moved with faces like mine, we don't want to do business with y'all. Because we already understand what your politics are. We already understand what your problems are, right? Just by looking at your company and your organization, the makeup of your company and the makeup of your organization. You can't talk diversity. You can't talk your commitment to that, right? If your company and your organization does not look like that, and furthermore, your leadership doesn't look like that. If your leadership doesn't reflect diversity, then please don't tell me how committed your organization is to diversity. According to Wilson, Black consumers with their leadership no longer demand only jobs and a few franchises for their support of large corporations, but should demand significant equity in them. They should demand equity in them, equity owned by Black not-for-profit organizations or by for-profit Commonwealth mutual funds, which the Black community owns through its investments in them. Remember, Wilson said, what should Black folks ask for all this loyalty that we're giving them? Wilson lays it out. We should be demanding equity in these businesses for the years of support that we've provided. And Wilson is saying that equity support can look in a myriad of ways. According to Wilson, African American Community Commonwealth funds should therefore not only invest in the economic infrastructure and development of the community, but also invest in corporate entities which profit significantly from the community, both here and across the diaspora. Wilson is saying that the equity ownership that we're going to have, right, and that we are demanding, right, is not one that merely is invested in the Black community, but it is also in the mainstream community as well, because this is where we're going to be able to stretch our arms out, right? This is where we're going to be able to make demands, right? And force the mainstream society to capitulate to those demands because of the pressure that we're applying. This is economic pluralism. It is African folks becoming active agents in their economic reality as opposed to being simple pieces on a board being shuffled around and moved around. We're no longer seeking to do business with folks and be their mascots. Right? We are looking for genuine and authentic partnership, and that's economic pluralism. Let's keep it moving. Creating and meeting Black consumer needs. Dr. Wilson emphasizes the fact that if Black consumers were to spend only a fraction of their dollars with Black businesses, the economic system which now characterizes the community would be radically transformed and Black economic and political power decisively enhanced. Right? Wilson is saying that if we just invest $1 more, $5 more, $10 more than what we currently invest, if we spend $1 more, $5 more, $10 more than what we currently spend with Black businesses, we would change drastically the economic reality of those businesses. It's not enough for us to keep saying it. We got to do it. Creating and meeting Black consumer needs. According to Wilson, the structuring of the American business and economic system along the race-based monopolistic lines compels the Black consumer to spend large bulks of his dollars with non-Black businesses, even if he were of a mind not to do so. What is Wilson saying here? Wilson, in this section, talks about the psychological campaigns that are put together to influence and indoctrinate Black consumers into spending their money with non-Black businesses. Right? So Wilson talks about the sales, right? And the marketing and the advertising to make Black folks believe that they're getting a deal by shopping with non-Black businesses that they otherwise wouldn't get, is a part of the overwhelming effect of white-owned media, right? And advertising. According to Wilson, the advantageous pricing and discount and stocking policies of white businesses, the imitation of white consumer patterns and tastes by many blacks, the identification of shopping in non-black business establishments by blacks with first-class citizenship, among other comparative advantages held by white and non-black businesses, converge to push the black consumer away from what few black businesses there are. The overwhelming effect of white-owned media and advertising helps convince and indoctrinate black folks into believing that they are better off shopping with and spending their money with white businesses. Wilson argues that it is the racist socio-psychological conditioning that produces a feel-good worthy experience and a sense of heightened self-esteem when he, the black consumer, shops in white-owned or non-black owned establishments, right? Uh, we see on social media young black folks put money up to their faces, posting their receipt bills, right, of how much money they've spent in these non-black stores and non-black restaurants, right? Wilson calls this that feel-good mentality, right? That shot of dopamine that you're able to spend your money, right? You have the consumptive privilege to spend your money like white folks do, right? And according to Wilson, it makes him feel that somehow the white man's ice is colder, that his sugar is sweeter, which stokes his need to curry the social acceptance of non-black merchants by being acknowledged by them, a consequence, Wilson argues, of self-hatred. Wilson argues that this type of overwhelming psychological impact of white media has helped to indoctrinate the black consumer into spending their money, right, in the community and with folks who care less about them. Wilson argues that the merchants of other ethnic groups can take for granted the commercial support of their own particular group, the unreserved support of black consumers, and a significant portion of other ethnic consumers. Wilson says that other groups are able to take advantage, right, or take for granted the support of their group or the support of black people or the support of other ethnic resources because they have a variety of streams of that they're receiving income from. They have they're getting money from all different demographic of people, right? So they can take for granted their own group or take for granted black people specifically, right? Because there are a number of people that they're getting money from. But Wilson argues black merchants, however, cannot take such privileges for granted, especially the commercial support from non-blacks, right? They cannot take for granted the commercial support of their own ethnic group. We can't just assume that non-black businesses are going to spend their money with us, right? Especially if they have the means of establishing and developing that same product, right, faster and cheaper. There's absolutely no incentive for them to do business with us. And again, we can't take for granted the support of our own community, right? Because we don't have a myriad of other groups of people spending money with us. So if we cannot hook our own community into getting them to see the value of purchasing African products, and goods that are developed by African people, then we may not have a chance. We may not stand a chance overall. Wilson reminds us that the black consumer is not a white consumer. Remember, when we looked at that data earlier, showed us that black folks disproportionately spend their money on products and goods, right? That other groups of people don't spend their money on. Or they spend their money, but they spend their money far less. They spend far less money on those products, right, than we do as black people. And so, according to Wilson, black consumers exhibit different spending patterns, spending more or less on a variety of products and services than white consumers. Black consumers' tastes are different from those of whites on a number of dimensions, and this is very important. Yet, the way in which our black celebrities spend their money, right, it would socialize us into believing that black folks and white folks have the same type of taste, right? Or want and desire the same things. But when you look at the data suggests something slightly different, right? Um, that black taste and white taste are totally different. The politics of black consumer taste. According to Wilson, the black consumer taste and habits are not monolithic. or unchanging in that they reflect reactions to current fashions, trends, fads, and the like. It is pertinent in this context to note that these tastes and habits also reflect current states of political consciousness and stages of political social development. So Wilson is saying that black folks, right, we're not a monolith, right? All black people don't buy the same things, think the same way, act the same way, right? And furthermore, the particular spending patterns that were recorded in this research, right, are indicative of the particular times, right? It is indicative of the particular consciousness, right, of those black folks at that particular time, right? But it is pertinent in this context to note that these tastes and habits also reflect current states of political consciousness and stages of political social development. The fact that many blacks have been deeply influenced by the black nationalists, black pride, and Afrocentric movements is reflective in the large number of them who consistently wear apparel projecting African-centered images, right? So Wilson is saying that there's a connection between African-centered consciousness, right, and uh, its influence by Black nationalists, Black pride, and Afrocentric movements. I was born in the 80s, raised in the 90s, so I saw a lot of the cultural fashion being projected in and throughout the culture. We don't see as much of that Afrocentric focus in fashion today as we saw in the 90s. And I would be really, really, really interested in hearing people's takes on why they believe um, African people today are not as Afrocentric as maybe our brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles were in the 90s. The broad extent of Black consumers' demand for things African and African American, as well as things sold by African American merchants, is demonstrated by the vast increase in the number of vendors, shopkeepers, and wholesalers across the country in the past 2 decades who distribute and sell African style merchandise. It's important to discuss this and to note this, right? That at the printing of this book and the making of this book, right in the 90s, parts of New York was widely known, right, for a lot of these African merchants, right, standing on the street corners and peddling a lot of this merchandise directly from the continent, right, or shipped to them from a particular connection in the continent, right. And Wilson is saying that a lot of the desire from for Afrocentric and African American merchandise comes a lot from these vendors and shopkeepers and wholesalers, right? That African American people interact with on a daily basis. According to Wilson, the growing African centeredness of Black consumers has been the result of the Afrocentric movement, which, taking advantage of American race politics, using all of the classic methods of propaganda and attitude change, has had a remarkable impact on the African American community and the nation as a whole, right? Wilson argues that this applies to the spending habits and tastes of Black consumers as well, that the Afrocentric movement has helped to influence the spending habits of Black consumers. Black consumers responding to Black nationalist appeals, Afrocentrism, and to the obvious failures of the politics of assimilation, the virulent racism of white America, the crushing economic and social crises of urban Black America today, as well as to the possibility for developing really significant economic, political power in the world. Folks are becoming more politically sensitive about their spending and consumption habits, right? Wilson says that Black preferences for things Black or African preferences for things African can be directly linked to a rejection of assimilation, a rejection of white racism, married with a driving passion for developing significant economic and political power in the world. And our spending power has to reflect this kind of consciousness. So while we're making these conscious decisions with our apparel, I would even argue with our hair, right? More folks are starting to lock their hair or wear their hair more naturally, right? Wilson is saying that all of this is a reflection of the Afrocentric movement and its influences in the community, right? But Wilson also wants to encourage this, that this has to start to happen economically as well, right? This level of consciousness should be mirrored, right, in our economics, all right? The economics of Afrocentrism. According to Wilson, the profitability of Afrocentrism is graphically demonstrated by Southern born African American Carol Riley's success with her two McDonald's franchises. Uh, Wilson cites Carol Riley reopened her two franchises in Harlem, refurbishing them with Afrocentric thematic designs, right? If anyone is familiar with the movie Coming to America, There's the scene right in there where Eddie and what's the other gentleman's name? Uh, Wilson argued that non-Black merchants are taking note of the enormous potential of the Black consumer market and the changing tastes and sensitivities of Black consumers. For example, cosmetic companies are still seeking to grab a significant percentage of the 600 million to a billion of the Black consumer market for cosmetics. Again, this was the printing of this book, right, in the late 1990s, right, where the cosmetic industry was anywhere between 600 million to $1 billion. Well, today, right, as of 2022, the cosmetic industry is worth trillions of dollars. All right. Wilson argues that there is gold in African style and taste. According to Wilson, Africa has always influenced the taste and values of non Africans in innumerable ways. In these times of anti-African, anti-Black sentiment, particularly in the United States, it is forgotten that Africa, its raw materials, arts and crafts, food, products, cultural arts and sciences were central to the trades and commerce of ancient and modern worlds, right? And so in the same way in which Africa was critical to the development, right, of antiquity, Africa and its descendants throughout the world are going to be vitally important, right, to the modern world and the development, right, of modern times. According to Wilson, the ability of things African, of African commodities, tastes, and styles to heavily impact the non-African world market is still potent. Wilson argues that in order for this to happen, Africans must unashamedly claim their cultural identity and consciousness, creatively cultivate and evolve their spiritual and material resources, right? In order for Africa to reclaim, right, that influence that we have had historically, right, it is really going to take Africans throughout the world to unashamedly, right, to what do we say, uncompromisingly, right, to claim our cultural identity and consciousness, uh, to creatively cultivate and evolve the spiritual and material resources. Only we can do that. No one else can do that work for us. Wilson states the central contention in this section is that the discovery and/or social engineering of African taste by Africans themselves can lay the economic foundations for the construction of African wealth and power. I'm going to say that again. The discovery and/or social engineering of African taste by Africans themselves. We have to be in the business of being able to tend to our own preferences, right? Tend to our own taste. If not, someone else can indoctrinate and socialize us for foreign tastes, right? um, right? And then lay the foundations for the construction of their wealth. According to Wilson, if Africans also engineer the trade relations by which those tastes are satiated, right, then this is the fundamental challenge for Africans. For upon the rock of profitable African trade relations with other Africans will be built African trade relations with all people, right? Once we develop that system by which we're able to trade with other African peoples, we now have the mechanism for us to trade with the rest of the world, right? We want to build these internal mechanisms so that we can then introduce it to mainstream. The first part of this, though, is very, very critical, right? The central contention in this section is that the discovery and/or social engineering of African taste by Africans themselves can lay the economic foundation for the construction of African wealth and power. In the same way that when many immigrants come over to the United States, right, they establish these ethnic enclaves in their communities, and they develop those businesses that cater specifically to the unique taste and preferences of that ethnic group, right? We as African people have never done that here in America. We have not created a market that specifically speaks to the needs of African American people. According to Wilson, the trade in African goods is such that one warehouse on Manhattan's West Side serves as an informal wholesale bazaar to more than 1,000 African businessmen. Wilson goes on to state that Diop and other Senegalese vendors form a significant source of export trade and hard currency for the people and economy of Senegal. The significance of their trade is such that La Banque de l'Habitat de Senegal, a Senegalese-based bank located in New York, revealed that it transferred to Africa about $4 million by September of 1994, up from just 900,000 in the whole of 1993. So This African bank in New York went from, right, transferring about $900,000 in 1993 to Africa, right, to transferring $4 million to Africa, right, all in a matter of a year. According to Wilson, authentic African cloth and garments made for the U.S. markets are getting harder to come by because the market is being flooded by mass-produced African-style prints manufactured by large Asian and other mills. And this was long before Amazon, right? And all of these fly-by-night wholesalers that just pop up on Amazon now. Anybody can sell these goods. Um, a ton of non-black folks are selling Afrocentric goods, right, over Amazon, right, to the detriment of African vendors and African businessmen and women. Sellers of all hues on Amazon is getting rich off of the African desire for African and African-inspired products. Okay, African American entrepreneurs and African-centered marketing. In this particular section, Amos Wilson did a great job of highlighting um, Black businesses that were able to use specific names and titles and marketing, right, that spoke to the culture. So by Afrocentrizing the name and making the name culturally relatable, right, they were able to have a certain business success, right, because Black folks knew that this business was created for them. And so a few of those examples in the titles was Black Toys, right? Just Us Books, Afrocentric Weddings, right? There's a whole section here in this chapter on Afrocentric weddings and how lucrative that business has become, right, of Africans throughout the diaspora, African Americans wanting to have these traditional Afrocentric weddings and ceremonies, right? And colors for African people. All right, let's jump into it. The economics of cultural and subcultural identity. Wilson reminds us that cultural identity and its cultural varieties are not merely social statements or forms of personal and group self-definition. So our culture, right, don't just identify or define us, right, culturally, but they also define and determine economic behavior. So based on when you see a type of cultural people, right, it should say something about their economics, right? Wilson argued that people are so much more likely to positively respond to and consume items which reinforce their personal and cultural self-image, their aspirations, their personal and social concerns, social political consciousness, right? So we have to ask ourselves the question, why are there so many people within the culture, melanated people who do not want to be referred to as Black, right, or call themselves Black? Wilson argues that people are so much more likely to positively respond to and consume items which reinforce their personal and cultural self-image, right? And so we have to start to look at our self-image and why folks don't want to positively be identified as being Black, right? Entrepreneurs who market their products with these factors in mind and are more likely to succeed in the cultural marketplaces. For those of us who are seeking, right, to sell and promote cultural goods, we recognize that there's work that we have to do in the community of elevating, right, the consciousness, elevating the pride in being African. If we are going to condition the people to support Black businesses, right, and African businesses, then there has to be a love for self. There has to be a love for the culture, right, if you're going to support your cultural institutions. Wilson argues that when products use a readily recognizable subcultural lingo, it provides them with immediate name recognition and cultural identity. Moreover, the products are designed to suit the food taste and food values of their target teenage, young, adult, hip hop marketplaces by reaffirming the identity of its constituents, right? So just by using the names, right, and the terminologies and the phrases that we use in our music, right, that we use in our cultural lingo, right, and naming our using those to name our companies and our products, it immediately gives those companies and those products name recognition. That's a huge step to hurdle, right, in the economic world. For most businesses, they struggle with name recognition. But in the African community where music is huge. Hip hop is a huge tool and mechanism in our culture. It spreads all around the world, right? And so, by taking phrases and names and titles, right, from our culture, it immediately provides name recognition, right? Or it would immediately provide name recognition for many of our products, for many of our goods, if we sought that alternative. The economics of culture and subcultural identity. Wilson argued that there is power contained in Africanicity, the sense of African identity and consciousness, the sense of African pride and self-esteem for the generation of Black wealth, prosperity, and political and economic power. If we are going to reinstitute and reclaim, right, our Black economic dominance, then we are going to have to reclaim our Africanicity, right? And Wilson says there's power in that. The examples presented here must be multiplied manyfold if wealth, prosperity, and power are to be realized and achieved world-class status and influence. If we are to increase our status and our influence as African people, right, then we recognize that there's a significant amount of work that has to be done, right? This requires a planful, deliberate approach by African Americans, right, and the Pan-African community and their leadership. It requires the pre-existing and newly funded businesses in African American and worldwide community be adequately financed, managed, and supported by us. By us. There is no coincidence that the next chapter that I'm going to jump into and focus on will be on Black banks, right? And how we finance our liberation, how we finance the end of white domination over us, right? Is through us supporting our own institutions and organizations. African peoples, the white man's golden geese. According to Dr. Wilson, the continued unabated behavior of the Black consumer, even to the present moment, is what allowed African people to be one of the white man's most greatest sources of wealth. His golden geese who lay his golden eggs, right? The continued unabated behavior of the Black consumer. There are things that we are consistently doing that we are allowing to go unchecked, right? This power differential that we talked about from the beginning of the book, the only way that power differential is going to be dealt with is by African people doing something about it. And Wilson is saying that because we have refused to do something about this power differential, we continue to allow ourselves to be exploited, right? And allow ourselves to continue to be the white man's most greatest source of wealth. According to Wilson, some may say that these people are golden sheep, sheep sheared of their golden fleeces by white rustlers, our golden fleeces being our natural resources or our ethnic resources and material resources. Wilson argues that regardless of its name, the outcome is usually the same: Black people producing and consuming to enrich others while impoverishing themselves, right? Whether we speak of slavery, peonage, manual labor, glass selling, sports, music, or cosmetics, wherever they generate millions or billions of dollars, whether through forced or waged labor, through creative, culturally based productivity, or reactionarily conditioned consumerism, Blacks have allowed the fruits of their labor to be eaten by others while they hungrily scavenge amongst themselves. The way Wilson put that together is beautiful. Blacks have allowed their fruits, right, to be eaten while we starve. We are working to benefit everybody else. We are making the great white machine fat and healthy, right? While we are every day becoming ill-equipped to provide for ourselves and are becoming anemic as a result of it. Wilson argues that since emancipation, this white instigated feat has been accomplished through the activation of one basic Eurocentric free market rule: prevent Blacks from having access to the marketplaces of others and prevent them from having access to their own marketplaces. Wilson says that this has been the basic rule of the free market. It is to prevent Blacks from having access to the marketplaces of others and even to their own marketplaces. X them out, exclude them. According to Wilson, the same white-owned manufacturers, wholesale and retail stores, which refuse to hire and promote Blacks, are rapaciously taking over previously Black-owned cosmetic companies. They instead are manufacturing counterfeit cosmetic beauty aids for the African American market. and habitually engage in all types of restraint of trade practices against Black-owned cosmetic manufacturers, distributors, dealers, and retailers, right? So recognizing, right, that these white companies did nothing to promote and advertise or create makeup that suited the skin tones and complexions of Black and brown women. They have just bought up those companies, right? Bought up those brands that was marketing to those individuals, right? It's really interesting when talking about cosmetics, right? Mr. Dr. Wilson transitioned long before the birth of Rihanna. And we know that today Rihanna's success in the cosmetic field, right, has caused some of the major Eurocentric or European cosmetic lines to go bankrupt. Right, they're closing their doors because of Rihanna's Savage Fenty makeup. Here was a Black woman who decided to create makeup representative of all skin tones, and because she had that revolutionary idea, right, is helping to bankrupt some of the European companies that dominated this cosmetic space, right, prior to her arrival. That is just one example of the possibility of what we can do as Black consumers, right, or Black businessmen and women once we start to create and speak to the unique taste and preferences of our people. Citing the final call of 1993, Wilson argues that Black business persons commonly complain that when these distributors reluctantly condescend to deliver Black made products to retailers, they gouge Black consumers and make unconsciously large per unit profits by pricing these products some 40 to 60% higher than necessary, right? The markup. The markup on these Black goods, they know that Black folks are going to buy them, need them, um, and so what they do is they mark those products up. Wilson argues that major retailers such as giant supermarkets and drugstore chains collude with distributors in this process. The collusion between white-owned retailers and distributors operates to prevent many Black manufacturers from delivering their products directly from their plants to store shelves, right? When enough shelf space is even made available to them, right, with a single price markup. And so, what Wilson is pointing out here is that there is this collusion between the distributors, right, and the store owners, and the store owners are colluding with the distributors to only put the goods, right, on their shelves that they've contracted with, right, and to disregard the Black owned and Black manufactured goods and products. There's a concerted effort that's going into that. If this trade block, according to Wilson, if this trade block were removed, argues Wilson, the price of the Black manufactured cosmetic products would be markedly reduced and made competitive with their white manufactured counterparts, more broadly distributed and easily retailed. The question that we have to ask Dr. Wilson is, do we really think then or now that white folks want this type of competition? That white companies want that type of competition with Black manufacturers, right? If the Black community had the choice between buying a product that they knew was created by someone like themselves who used this product for themselves or for their children, then Black folks are more likely to buy that product. And our counterparts know that, and thus is the reason why we are xed out of the equation from Jump Street, because in effect, essentially, there wouldn't be any competition. Solutions, according to Wilson, whether these ends will be accomplished depends first and foremost on the discernment and selectivity of Black consumers, right? We got to be judicious with our dollars, with our spending power. The ball is in our court to get strategic with our spending power. According to Wilson, our achievement also depends on organized efforts in this direction by Blacks in the industry, by their efforts of concerned civil rights and community organizations, and most importantly, by the activities of a conscious African American community determined that it will benefit first and foremost from its own labor. We're tired of other folks eating off of us. We're going to benefit from our own wealth. We're tired of putting our wealth and our money and depositing that in other people's communities, right? We're going to benefit from our own productivity, creativity, our own industry, right? And from the commercial and business activities that other communities carry out with and within its business establishments and marketplaces, we're going to leverage that to our benefit. We're going to have other folks start to work for us as opposed to us working for other people. Solutions. Wilson argues that the African American community can no longer afford to let other ethnic communities own, control, and broker its labor, culture, and cultural products. Right? We Black folks have to control our own communities. We have to control and broker our own labor, right? The making and selling of its own cultural symbols and products in community and world markets by non-African manufacturers and merchants represents a gross insult into a poverty-stricken, underemployed African community which cannot afford to endure for 1 second more its exploitation by aliens. If we think about street activity, right? There's street organizations that would never let its opposition set up on its block, set up in its territory, right, and sell the same product that they're selling. And that's essentially what we as African people are doing. We are allowing other non-Black folks to literally establish businesses in our communities and take our money from us. Wilson is saying that we need a change mentality and philosophy of the Black community. We need a different type of Black leadership, right, to course correct. Solutions. Wilson argues in sum, a society's social, cultural production and consumption, and its ownership or control over these are the sources of its wealth and the determinants of its overall well-being, power, and influence, right? These activities determine the deployment and employment of its constituents, right? Their occupations and preoccupations. So when we're talking about calling ourselves a nation and being a nation, this is what it means. This is what a nation looks like, right? It's a society's social, cultural production and consumption and its ownership or control over these are the sources of its wealth. We own and control the social and cultural production of our goods, right? According to Wilson, this is especially important for African American and Pan African rural communities, which are being abandoned and economically isolated by the national and international economies. Right? It is not the work of white folks to save the Black community. And if we are continuing to wait for a white savior to save our community, it is not going to come. Right? We have been abandoned and economically isolated. And so, like the plans of W.E.B. Du Bois, like the plans of Dr. Chancellor Williams, and the plans of Dr. Amos Wilson, if we don't get ready to do for self and organize ourselves, we are going to remain abandoned and remain isolated. Black self-employment. According to Wilson, the reemployment of and creation of new jobs for Black workers must, in ever more increasing numbers, come from Black-owned companies. If Black folks are seeking work and employment, it has to be the job of Black companies and Black businesses to provide that work. Otherwise, again, we're just tossing all the fruits of our labor, right, to the wayside. We're giving it to somebody else. At this juncture, at least 40% of Black-owned firms employ all Black employees. Some 60% of Black-owned firms employ a staffing consisting of at least 75% Black and minority workers. And this compares with non-minority owned firms whose workforces consisted of an average 11% Black and minority employees. It's important to understand that those were the numbers as of the printing of this book. And Wilson reminds us that these figures must not be construed to mean that Black-owned businesses have captured the majority of the Black and minority customers, right? They indicate that these businesses are more or less totally dependent on a very small percentage of Black minority customers, right? And this means that if they are to expand and increase their employment of Black workers, they must capture a rapidly expanding number of Black customers and an increasingly larger share of the Black customer dollar, right? So even for those numbers that we just looked at in the last slide, Wilson is reminding us, right, that we cannot fall victim to the ideology or the myth of believing that Black businesses want they control and receive 100% of the Black consumer dollar. It's just not true. They only get a very small fraction of Black consumer dollars, right? And in order to rapidly expand that, right, we're going to need Black businesses, Black organizations around the world to start to organize themselves a little bit better as a way for us to recapture a larger share of that Black customer dollar. Lastly, Wilson goes on to argue that if we are to compete in the national and international marketplaces, that we must strategically hire more Black workers from other ethnic groups, redesign their establishment, and redefine their tactics and techniques in order to overcome the market resistance of other communities, right? We have to deploy our brothers and sisters in other communities to do this work. We need like-minded Africans, right, around the world and in a myriad of organizations lobbying, right, fighting and advocating on behalf of Black nationalist, African nationalist people, right, the world over. Wilson says, however, for African Americans and Africans across the diaspora, business begins at home. It begins with the capturing and servicing of their home markets and securing the loyalty of their own compatriots, right? If we cannot convince the brothers and sisters in our own proximity, right, the importance of this work, there's no way we're going to be able to take this message on the road. There's no way we're going to take this message across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, right? We got to perfect this message here at home, right? We've got to change hearts and minds right in the squares that we are located in. And then based off of that success, right, we can then start to take that out further. According to Wilson, it begins with actualizing the potentials of their own cultures, developing, controlling, and owning their own cultural products. With their home base secured, then they may venture forth to capture new territories and bring home wondrous trophies of economic war. We are at war, everybody. We are at war, and every gain that we sustain, right, or that we accomplish in this war, right, we won. Nobody gave us anything, and nobody's going to give us a damn thing. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention with this lecture. I look forward to us hopping into our next lecture, which will focus primarily on Black banks. All right. Hotel. Peace, family.